Hey y'all, it's Stacy. Welcome back to the kitchen. Today we're making a Thanksgiving classic. This is my quick and easy recipe for Southern cornbread dressing. I'm going to show you some shortcuts to make this process really easy. And it's impossible to talk about cornbread dressing and not talk about stuffing. Stuffing and dressing are not the same things. If you head over to the blog and check out the recipe on the website, there's a ton of information about what we think the difference between stuffing and dressing is. I'm going to show you the cornbread dressing recipe today. We're going to start with about 7 cups of crumbled cornbread. Now, to make this process a little bit easier, I've also included a recipe for the cornbread that I use in this recipe on this blog post as well. So you'll find the recipe for the dressing as well as the cornbread to make the dressing. Now, I made this yesterday, and all I'm gonna do is just crumble this up. It doesn't have to be perfect because once we introduce our liquid, it's gonna break down a little bit more. Again, you're gonna need about 7 cups, but this recipe makes pretty much 7 cups, so that's why I included it on the blog post with this recipe. Now, some people also will use some loaf bread, some white bread, some crumbled biscuits, that's perfectly fine. You know, every family has their own kind of twist on cornbread dressing. This recipe is just super basic and easy, so I don't include those things. This is just cornbread, but you could absolutely add some of those things, just keeping in mind that you're gonna need about 7 total cups of dried cornbread or bread or whatever else it is. That way we keep the ratio of bread to liquid correct. You could also add some additional liquid if you needed to. All right, our cornbread is ready. Let's move on to our next step. All right, so 2 flavors that I think are essential in cornbread dressing are onions and celery. So I'm gonna chop a small onion here to go in this. It's important to keep in mind though, that we wanna chop this pretty finely. The cook time might not be long enough to cook this onion all the way through, and so you might still have onion that has kind of a crunchy texture. So chopping it finely helps with that process. Several years ago though, a reader mentioned something to me that I actually think is genius. I had already put this recipe on the blog, but I will tell you it's a method that I use now at home. What she does is she chops her celery and her onion in advance and mixes it in her cornbread batter and bakes it with the cornbread. That way you get all that great flavor, but you don't have the crunch. So that's one thing that I would suggest if you're going to add celery and onion to your dressing. That's one thing that you can do, is to bake those things in with this. Now, in this particular recipe, I do add the onion, but I don't add the celery. And the reason is, I typically use cream of chicken soup and a can of cream of celery soup. That's just a shortcut that gives us some of that great flavor and the great texture as well. If you just totally don't want to use onion, you could use onion powder. That way you can have that flavor without the onion crunch. All right, so back to our cornbread. We're gonna add our chopped onion right here to this. I've got a can of cream of chicken and, like I said, a can of cream of celery. I always hear a little pushback from folks about using canned cream of soups. You know, it's easy, it's quick, it adds tons of flavor and a great texture, but if you want to make homemade cream of soups, knock yourself out. And while some folks are scared of the ingredient list on a can like this, there are times when we should have been that way, but I think if you were to look at it now, it's not going to be nearly as scary as it once was. All right, to this, I'm going to add about 2 cups of chicken broth or turkey broth. Now, you can also use the broth from a roasted turkey. Just keep in mind that however you flavored that turkey, you're going to give your dressing that flavor too. That's also why we're going to be cautious about adding salt and pepper here, because if you had heavy salt and pepper on your turkey and you use that broth from the turkey, that salt and pepper is going to flavor this as well. And I've found that when you make this exact recipe for cornbread, that about 2 cups is what you're going to need. But you may need a little bit more. The idea is that we want this to be pretty soupy because as we bake it, the cornbread crumbles in here are going to absorb this moisture. And we don't want dry cornbread dressing, so we want to make sure that it's pretty liquidy when it goes into the pan. Now, another common ingredient that you might find in cornbread dressing is either sage, ground sage, rubbed sage, or like a poultry seasoning. I grew up with a mother and a grandmother that never used either of those in dressing. So to me, that just doesn't taste like dressing. If you were going to add that, you would want to add that right here. And the specific amount that you need is just based on taste. And because everything that we have in here that we've mixed in is safe to taste now, you can actually taste this at this point and add that rubbed sage or poultry seasoning and the salt and pepper until you get it to the point where you like it. I'm going to give this a taste. Because of the salt that was in the broth and in the canned goods there, I don't need tons of salt, just a little bit. I'm going to add some black pepper here. And just stir this together. Now I've got my oven preheated to 350 degrees. I've got a 9 by 13 inch baking dish here that I'm going to spray with a little non-stick cooking spray, and in typical Stacy fashion, I'm going to spray it right over my dirty dishes in my dishwasher. That way that overspray is trapped there and not all over my kitchen. Pour this right into our baking dish here. Now we're just going to kind of smooth this out a little here, and you can see that texture. This is about where we want the liquid amount to be in our dressing so that we ensure that we don't end up with dry dressing. This is going to go in our oven, like I said, at 350 degrees for 30 to 40 minutes or until it's set and it's nice and golden brown on the top. All right, so our dressing baked for about 35 to 40 minutes. You can see that it browned up nicely. And that's it. Like I said, there's some great things that you can do to kind of make this your own, but this is just a good basic recipe to be able to get some delicious cornbread dressing on the table. Y'all enjoy.